Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to one more installment of the study of the book of Acts. And tonight we'll be on chapter 21. And let's begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commands and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. All right. Again, welcome to everybody that is here tonight, and we got a lot to cover, and I don't even know that I'll cover it. I've got too many words stacked into this, so we'll just run through it and see what. If we don't get through it, well, we'll pick it up again next week and finish off chapter 1 next week. So tonight we are seeing the very tail end of Paul's third missionary journey, as he makes his way back to Jerusalem, and it's via a series of port calls, and he changes vessels at least once. And so if you look over here on this chart that we've got here, the Paul's third missionary mission journey, and it is pretty much 54 to 57 AD or CE, and so he's finishing that off now, and he's on his way back home. So let's go ahead and here is the map of where we're going to be covering, because when we left last week, he was right down here in Miletus, just south of Ephesus, and from there we'll see that he goes to Kos, to Rhodes, to Patera, and then over to Tyre, Ptolemais, Caesarea, and then he finally works his way over to Jerusalem. So let's go ahead with the verses. After tearing ourselves away from them and setting sail, we set a straight course to Kos, the next day to Rhodes, and then from there to Patera. Finding a ship crossing to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. When we came in sight of Cyprus, passing it by on the left, we kept sailing to Syria and landed in Tyre. For there, the ship was to unload the cargo. All right, now the parting there I wanted to show you a picture of the harbor in Kos. Now this harbor, this is the same harbor that Paul landed in. Of course, they've made some improvements, and you'll see this old Byzantine fort here that was there, but it wasn't there when Paul was there. That would have been a few hundred years later, and maybe this was even geared up and built up during the Crusades. But you can see as they would sail in here, this would be a very nice little port. It'd be secure, and if you look at some of these boats that are down here, you see these down here. That's just about maybe the size of something that Paul would have been sailing in when he came into the port of Kos, and that kind of gives you an idea of the size of it. And so he goes into Kos. That parting that they left at Miletus, very emotional. Pretty much everybody knew that was the last time that they were going to see Paul. So that's why it kind of speaks of them having to tear themselves away from the folks there at Ephesus, because he had been there pouring out his heart and soul to them for 3 years. And so, yes, it would have been very emotional. So it was a one-day trip from Miletus down to Kos, and that we see the harbor is very secure, and was in those days and as now, it's a very popular layover spot. Now, Kos was just to kind of give you an idea of these places, it was the home of the medical school founded by Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE. So it had been a medical school there for 500 or 600 years. And of course, then it followed that this would be a major center for the worship of Asclepius. Easy for you to say. Asclepius, the god of healing. Now, if you remember when we taught about that when Paul was going through some of his other missionary trips, that it was the symbol of Asclepius was the snake wrapped around the double snake wrapped around the stave or the cross, and they're looking at each other. So the island itself was they exported wine and costly ointments, and some of the ointments that they would have exported were things made like salves and things for the eyes or skin conditions and so forth. Just that kind of an ointment, and they were used for healing. And then they also had purple dye because they had those murex snails around there, and then of course fabrics. So a day later, then they would come to the port of Rhodes. Now, this is the little harbor at Rhodes. Again, the same harbor that was there 2,000 years ago. This is that same harbor. And you can see again where they could go into here and it would be secure from a lot of the winds, and they wouldn't have any waves in there. And again, the ship that Paul would have been on would probably be a little bit smaller than this one right here that I'm pointing to. It would have only been maybe at the most 75 feet long. So now, the port of Rhodes, it's on the island of Rhodes, and it was a very prosperous city involved in the maritime trade. It is also famous for having one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Colossus of Rhodes, and it was a 100-foot tall bronze statue of a man whose legs straddled the harbor entrance. So they tell us that this statue, 1 foot was here and 1 foot was here, and then the boats kind of sailed under it. I have a hard time picturing that because just the mere size. It was 100 feet tall. You know, the entrance would have had to have been very, very small, narrow, so that he could stand up fairly straight rather than doing the splits to do that, because then that way it would have also lowered his body, and the mast of the boats might have had some trouble getting under there. So the statue only stood. Now here's a representation of it. Who knows what it looked like? We don't know, but it only stood for 56 years before before an earthquake came in and toppled it. And by the time that Paul visited, I think it toppled in like 200, somewhere around 200 BCE. And by the time Paul visited the island, that's all that was left of this. All that was left of the statue was a bunch of scrap bronze on the that littered the waterway on the beaches and so forth. They tell me that I don't know, 500 or 600 years after, or 700 years, something like that, after Paul, when the Arabs came through and conquered the island, that they gathered up all the bronze and sold it to a Jewish merchant for scrap metal. And then, of course, the Jewish guy probably took it and made some kind of a investment, or did something with it and made a killing off of it. So, but that was what where they would have sailed through there, and I could sort of see if they sailed through a deal like this, it may have been possible. But even that, I believe if you were to count up these guys here, that's probably more than 100 feet. But it actually did exist. I always thought the Colossus of Rhodes was, when I was growing up, I said, well, that's a myth or a fairy tale, but no, it actually did exist. And from there, they sailed on over to Patera, which was on the southern coast of Turkey. And so there's, that was only about 10 miles off the coast, but then they had to travel a good bit down the coast to Patera. But Rhodes had been around for 500 years before Paul came through there, and so there again, we go to Patera. It was an important naval base during the Byzantine era, and actually before. But it was a good trading center. It lost its prominence later on when the Arabs conquered the area, and also the river upon which it was located was it started silting up. So the boats would run aground out there, and that really normally ruins your day when you got a ship and you run aground. But Patera was also known as the birthplace of Saint Nicholas, and it was from here then that Paul probably then he transferred to a much larger ship that would have made the journey from Patera to Tyre much safer, and it was probably some kind of a grain carrying vessel that could also accommodate some passengers, because the main commerce between there and Tyre was grain. So let's go, before we go with the other scriptures there. Anybody got any comments or questions? Yeah, the guy that the Saint Nicholas there, it is the same Saint Nicholas. He became the bishop of Myra or something like that. But yeah, that is the same Saint Nicholas of Christmas, of Santa Claus fame. Who knew that Santa Claus was a turkey? I mean, a Turk. So anyhow, but all right. All right. After let's go ahead with the next verses here. And where did I put those things? Oh, here we are. Said we okay, so they left. Let's do it this way. They left Patera, and then they sailed down to Tyre. Okay, now this is modern day Tyre. Okay, and this was there. The harbor would have been pretty much kind of in the sort of the same place right in here, but Tyre at one point was an island out here. And so you had part of Tyre out here on the island, and then the other part of it was over here on the land. And so the island part of it was fortified, and so it's kind of hard for anybody to conquer it until Alexander the Great showed up. Okay, so when Alexander the Great showed up, he had them. The city over here on the mainland had already been conquered and torn down, and the Bible said that it was going to be a wasteland and it would be cast into the sea. Well, for hundreds of years it was not cast into the sea. So is the Bible telling the truth or what? Well, Alexander the Great came through, and Al had all of his troops go out there, grab these the stones that they had built this city of Tyre with on the mainland, and start throwing them in the ocean. And he made a causeway that went all the way out here to the island, several hundred yards. And at that point, then he laid siege to the island and finally conquered it. So the Bible prophecy then came true that Tyre was destroyed and thrown into the sea. So it was later on rebuilt, and that's where Paul had landed, because once they got that causeway in there, then the sand and so forth started building up on either side of it, and they were then able to build on it. So, all right, and just so that you get an idea of just geographically where we're talking about, this was first century Israel. This is where Herod's kingdom. They're talking about Herod's kingdom. That you see some of the names there, but here's Tyre up here. And then the next place it's mentioned is Ptolemais, which is Akko, and it's actually Acre today is the city. And then around there, then you come down to Caesarea. All right, and so then from Caesarea, then it says that Paul went up to Jerusalem. All right. Going on with the verses here, we looked up the disciples and stayed there 7 days. They kept telling Paul through the Ruach not to set foot in Jerusalem. When our days there were over, we departed and went on our journey. They all, with wives and children, accompanied us until we were outside the city. After kneeling down on the shore and praying, we said farewell to one another. Then we boarded the ship, and they returned home. So this is leaving Patera, and then Paul goes to Tyre. Now it's about a 5 to 6 day journey from Patera over to Tyre, and that had been a long time Phoenician port of call. And so Paul gets there, and the first thing he does, he looks up any Messianic believers and spent 7 days with them. I thought it was kind of interesting. All the other places that Paul went to in his missionary journeys, he would go and look up a synagogue and then minister to the Jews in the synagogue. By this time, it almost appears that Paul was over that, because the first thing he did was to look up Messianic believers, and then he spent time with them instead of trying to go to the synagogues. Perhaps it was just a time of, okay, I've only got a limited time here. I don't have a whole bunch of time, so I'm going to make the most of it and try to strengthen the body of Messiah rather than going out and making new disciples at this point in his ministry. So anyway, we don't know if Paul knew people that were supposed to be there or not. We can't really tell. But at this point, we just know that it said that he looked them up and spent time with them. So we do know that the early believers settled in Tyre after the problems that we had with Stephen. You remember when Stephen was stoned? Then and there was a pretty good persecution of the body of Messiah there in Jerusalem. So a lot of them left town. Of course, all that did was that forced them out of their comfort zone, because it was either get out or die. And at that point, then they started telling about Yeshua wherever it was that they went. So, and that was 20 years ago, 27 years prior to Paul landing here. So there could have been a very well-established Messianic community there in Tyre by the time he got there. So through the gifting of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, these believers continuously warned. They kept telling Paul of the impending danger that he would, should he go ahead and continue on into Jerusalem, he was going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, it kind of appears that Paul recognized that. He acknowledged their concern, but he was still determined to continue. And We know what determination can do for you if you listened to my sermon yesterday. And if you haven't, I encourage you to get on Facebook, Tree of Life Houston, and pull up the sermon, because I was talking about the determination of Abraham, and Isaac and the comma. So you'll just have to look it up to see what that was all about. All right, go ahead. Let's see, verses 7 to 9. Okay, and here again, I apologize. I'm always behind on my notes here, but it would have taken them a week to discharge the cargo. In fact, some of the commentaries that I saw said that a typical grain ship might have taken as much as 12 days to completely discharge their cargo. But if it was a liner where they were just going from port to port to port, they maybe didn't have to discharge all of their cargo at one point. So, going ahead, when we had finished the trip from Tyre, we arrived at Ptolemais. We greeted the brothers and sisters and stayed with them for one day. On the next day, we departed and came to Caesarea. We entered the home of Philip, the proclaimer of good news, the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and we stayed with him. Now, this man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied. That seems, that stretch of verses there just seems a little bit disjointed to me, but we'll try to put it together here. Ptolemais was on a day trip south of Tyre. You remember where I showed you, and it was called Akko in the Tanakh, and today it's the city of Acre, which is on the north end of the harbor at Haifa. So Paul spent what little time he had there in Ptolemais with the believers that were there. You know, he just had one day, and so he spent it with them. And then the trip down to Caesarea, that would have taken at least 2 days by land, and maybe about the same or more by sea. We don't know. It's unclear how he got from Ptolemais down to Caesarea, but at any rate, he stayed with in the home of Philip the evangelist. Now, if you remember Philip, okay, this was not Philip the apostle. This was Philip the deacon, one of the first deacons there in the community of Messiah there in Jerusalem, where the widows said, "Hey, nobody's taking care of us," so they determined, okay, let's go ahead and appoint 7 guys, and they were all Hellenists. They were all Jews with a Greek heritage or a big Greek background or whatever. And so Philip was one of these. After Stephen was stoned, Philip took off for Samaria, where he did a lot of preaching, and then he went down. First of all, I guess he went down to Gaza, and that's where he met the Ethiopian eunuch that was reading Isaiah, and so Philip and the eunuch then got together on the chariot, and he explained to him the gospel, the Basora of Yeshua, and the eunuch he became a believer, and they baptized him right away, and then he took off, and then Philip moved on up to Caesarea. Caesarea was not really known as a Jewish-friendly city, but somehow he fit in there and stayed for the next 25 years. It said they had 4 daughters who had the gift of prophecy. Now, the description of virgins, so they were virgin daughters. That did not necessarily mean, in my mind, it says virgin daughters. That in my mind, it conjures up old maids. Okay, But no, that's not what they were talking about. That refers, it could very well refer to prepubescent girls, right before they became teenagers. Luke does not, though, give us any kind of indication or an account as to what were some of their prophecies. What was their track record? Were they like Nate Silver, the famous pollster that gave Hillary Clinton a 87% chance of winning, and then she didn't. Thank God. And so, that guy was, his prophecies or his ideas, they were no good. We see that all the time where people, they tout themselves as being some kind of a prophet or fortune teller. That's even worse. And then their prophecies don't come true. So he said these daughters had that gift of prophecy. And so we'll just leave it at that. Church history tells us that then they moved on up to, I believe, to an area in Asia Minor where they continued with preaching the gospel and prophesying. So, and I didn't give you my notes there again. So, but I did hit all of them. And I just noted that, 25 years after Yeshua ascended, he left earth. It seemed like the believers were everywhere. Just about anywhere Paul stopped, there were some believers. So the gospel was definitely being spread. Verse 10, while we stayed there for a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. He came to look at he came to us, took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet, and said, the Ruach HaKodesh says this, in this way shall the Jewish people in Jerusalem bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles. When he had heard these things, both we and the local people urged Paul not to go up to Jerusalem. All right. We've run into Agabus before. Does anybody remember where we had Agabus? Okay. Anybody want to take a guess, a stab at where he showed up? Okay. It is in, if you're reading my notes there, it's chapter 11, 26 to 27. And he foretold of this famine that was going to hit Jerusalem. And so it was on that, because of that famine, that Paul and others were collecting money for the believers there in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. So it was common. It was a common thing for some of these prophets in the Middle East areas to be kind of graphic and demonstrative in what they would do. And so here Agabus was very demonstrative. He took Paul's belt, which actually the belt could have been a big leather belt. Remember, Paul was a worker in leather. So, who knows? He might have made him a big, nice leather belt to hold up whatever needed to be held up. And so this guy took this belt and he wrapped it, it said, around his feet and his hands. And so that's kind of unusual. It's kind of strange. And he says the Ruach HaKodesh says this. And so what Agabus is telling us here, these are not my words. It's like in prophecy sometimes today, if you're in a Pentecostal church, you'll hear somebody get up there and they'll say, and thus saith the Lord. They always do that in King James English, by the way. That's just one of the rules. You got to do it in King James English. Um, but uh, in fact, maybe that's not true anymore. I haven't been to a Pentecostal church in many, many years since they've gotten all of the newer versions of the Bible. So now they may do it in NIV or something like that. But back in the day, it was always King James with these and thous and that sort of stuff. So, but that's what Agabus does. He grabs the belt, puts it on his own hands and feet, and he says, the same way that I'm being tied up here, that the Holy Spirit is telling me that this same sort of thing is going to happen to Paul when he goes to Jerusalem. He will be carried away and imprisoned. But you know, the host there in Caesarea, they decided, they're trying to talk him out of this. They're talking Paul out of going to Jerusalem. He said, no, you don't need to do that. Remember, Paul, they tried to get him up in Corinth, and so what did he do? He avoided it. He just went someplace else and avoided the trouble. He could do that here. He could have gone and said, okay, I don't want to run. I just don't have time for all this persecution stuff right now. But Paul knew something we didn't. He had the mind of the Lord, and so he just didn't tell. He did not acquiesce to these people. So while acknowledging the prophetic words and the concern of the believers, Paul told them that this was something that he just had to do. He was determined to go, again, that determination, and he was willing to die for the sake of the gospel, the Basora of Yeshua, if necessary. So when this company of believers that was there with him in the home of Philip in Caesarea, they heard this, and Paul, he just wouldn't listen to them, and so finally they just says, okay, well, we'll just sit back, and the only thing we can say is, well, may the Lord's will be done. And so they're, I don't know. It seemed to me like there are times in some of our lives, and when in the natural, it looks like that we're really gonna go and do something stupid, and it's not safe, or it's not following conventional wisdom, but you know that the Lord is in it and he's telling you to go do that. So the best answer is like Abraham gave the Lord when he called him. He says, Hineni, here I am. And so Paul was definitely at this point. All right, so we got a note here from my daughter. It said, Mike Bickle of IHOP up in Kansas City forbids his folks of saying, thus saith the Lord, just to protect the Lord's voice. He jokingly allows upper leadership, he says, he allows them 4 thus saith cards per year. That's funny. But, I don't know, any of you that have actually grown up in the Pentecostal system of religion would understand exactly what I'm talking about there with the thus saith the Lord. And when you do say that, though, again, one of the rules, you have to say thus saith the Lord. So anyway, I'm sort of making fun, and I shouldn't, but sometimes that stuff kind of gets ahead of people. All right, so he started the trek, that inland trek into Jerusalem, staying about, halfway there. He stayed at the home of this long-time believer, guy named Manason. And I guess that's how you say that. I don't know. It sounded reasonable. And he was probably a Jewish believer of the Hellenistic persuasion. He was more, instead of Sabra being born and raised in Israel, he's more of the Hellenistic, maybe from the diaspora, someplace, and so he would have been much more amenable to hosting a mixed group of Jewish and non-Jewish believers staying at his home. So, those kind of things as you look through this stuff in the Brit Hadashah in the New Testament, that you see, what, there was still a measure of quite a bit of a measure of anti-Semitism and kind of separation between the Jews and the Gentiles. And so so if you even today within the Messianic movement, you still have some of this foolishness of the separation between the Jews and the Gentiles. That middle wall is still there in a lot of cases, even though it was supposed to have been torn down. It is still there. Okay, Anjana says that it is so common in India, Pentecostal churches stick to this for prophesying and even during sermons. Yeah, well, I have seen people interrupt sermons before, and it can be disruptive to say the least when somebody does that. Oh my goodness! Somebody just brought me a nice cup of coffee, and so I'm just very, very thankful that I got this nice cup of coffee, and you see that. Okay, now I'm going to send her back to her stuff, and that's what happens when you have a live studio audience. Okay. So anyway, yeah, interrupting a sermon with some kind of an utterance from the Holy Spirit. Paul said, you got to be really, really careful about that. He had a bunch of rules on how to do that in a church. It's not unprecedented, and it's not something that is wrong per se. But Paul did say, okay, you got to do it in good order, and there are certain rules. All right, that's a rabbi trail. I didn't mean to get onto that. So Paul, he heads on up, and he stays in the house of Manason, and then he goes on into Jerusalem. It says, when we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers and the sisters welcomed us gladly. On the next day, Paul went in with us to Jacob. And what they're saying here, this is Luke talking. On the next day, Paul went in with us. That the whole body of his entourage, and all the elders were present. And so we have it looks like what we have here is two different meetings that we have. It says, after greeting them, he reported to them in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his service. Now, on arrival in Jerusalem, okay, yeah, here we go. When we arrived in Jerusalem, okay, there he said the brothers and the men and the women, brothers and the sisters welcomed him, and so it was. You can imagine it would have been quite a joyous reunion, I guess, because Paul hadn't seen these guys in 5 years or so, in some cases, so and in other cases even longer. So Luke, again, I see, is very careful in kind of giving some equal billing to the ladies, the women believers, and so that's very unusual for the Middle East at that day and today too. That women were they were counted as equal partners, and so this is the correct way to be, because salvation, when it comes to salvation in Yeshua, there is no difference between men and women, Jew and Gentile, free or slaves. And so Messianic Judaism was and is a great equalizer. So the next day, then that's when he first arrived. He met with like the congregation, everybody. Okay, the next day he goes just to the board of directors there of the First Messianic synagogue in Jerusalem, and in that he met with Jacob. If you read the King James version, it's a guy named James. He's the half brother of Yeshua, and so he delivers a report to these guys in detail for what he had been doing. He gives an account of himself for the last 5 years that or so that he's been out on the mission field. Um, so it's kind of like Paul recognizes where the authority within the body is, and so he's telling them all of that. And Luke didn't give any mention of the donation that they brought from Asia Minor and from Greece. And we don't really know why. Some people say, well, it's because maybe these Jews in Jerusalem wouldn't take the money because it came from the those Gentiles, and I reject that out of hand because some of the ones that make the comment are also the ones that said that God is done with the Jewish people and we no longer count for anything, and that the church has taken over for us. But what I think is he didn't mention the money because it was not pertinent to the narrative of Paul and his ministry, and also to how that the Lord was working things out in these next few events that was going to bring Paul into the presence of rulers, and empires and so forth, the things that Paul would have never had entrance into, but now he's going to have those. So I think that Luke didn't mention it because it just wasn't pertinent to the theme that he was trying to develop here. So and if it was one of those kind of a deals where they wouldn't take it because of the idea of that, these are Gentiles, we're not going to take their money because it's somehow unclean. Well, that sort of stuff, those old social barriers are often very, very, very hard to destroy overnight. So going ahead, and are there any questions so far? I mean, I'm talking 90 to nothing to try to get through these this stuff here tonight, because I do know I've got a lot to say, and I've only got 15 more minutes to do it. No, any comments or questions so far? Save them up. Go ahead and put them on the chat, and we'll talk at them that way. Okay, verse 20. And when they heard, they began glorifying God. They said, "You see, brother, how many myriads there are among the Jewish people who have believed, and they are all zealous for the Torah. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jewish people among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to walk according to the customs. What's to be done then? No doubt they will hear that you have come." All right, so what do we got here? We've got the idea that that is great, Paul, that you've done all of this stuff, and there's been thousands, myriads, meaning thousands of Jewish people who have believed, and they're all zealous for the Torah, and then it's like, but and so whenever you got that, then you better start paying attention, because there's something coming. And so what it is they're talking about Paul. They've been reporting that he is basically telling people or turning people away from true Judaism by telling them they don't have to do that stuff anymore. They don't need to. It's okay. You can go down to the uh, First Presbyterian Church or wherever it is, and forget about being Jewish, and have a ham sandwich if you want to. It's okay. And so that's basically, and that stuff about the minor surgery on the boys at 8 days. No, that's barbaric. We don't do that anymore. That's what they're trying to say that Paul was doing. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Paul never did that. It's amazing when I'm reading, researching all of this stuff, how many of these guys with all these DDs behind their name. Some of them have 2 or 3 DDs, um, a Doctor of Divinity, and they're talking about when Paul was converted to Christianity, and then at what point did the disciples uh, stop obeying the law and just obeyed the law of Christ, because the law of Moses had no effect on them or anything. So they still, some of these people still cling to that sort of stuff, and of course that's not what I teach. The law is still relevant to us today. Some parts of it we cannot do because there is no temple, but we do know that the law is just as relevant today for us. It's still God's standard of holiness. Yeshua said it's not going to go away until the heaven and earth are gone, and then at that point we'll have a new set of a new operating manual. So anyway, going ahead, I don't want to get on another rabbi trail. So that's what these guys were saying, that Paul was telling them to get away from Judaism. So what are they going to do? The elders were kind of in a bind here. On one hand, they had supported Paul's witness to the Gentiles in the Jerusalem conference back in Acts 15, and now they found Paul in some quarters of Jerusalem. He was a persona non grata, and his mission was discredited because the standard mainstream Jewish populace heard that he was trying to get people away from Torah, but also that some of his own converts seemed to have jumped the shark and decided that, Paul was trying to get us away from this and try to join, that big church down the way and forget about Judaism. So they even though they praised Paul for his work in missions and so forth, they still had their own mission to the Jews to consider, and so in their mind, Paul could very well be a distinct liability. Now, here we come, from here, then from here on until the end of Acts, Paul argued before various audiences that he was a loyal Jew, and that his mission to the Gentiles was not anti-Jewish. All right, and I can't say it enough that Paul was not anti-Jewish. He was born a Jew. He died a Jew. He, had he had the same customs then as we do today, he would have been buried in his tallit with one of the fringes cut off. I mean, the guy was he was true blue. He was a Jew's Jew, and he died a Jew's Jew. So we're going ahead there in the verses 23 and 26. So tell you what you do. We got 4 men who have a vow on themselves. Take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so they may shave their heads that way. All will realize there's nothing to the things that we've been told about you, but that you yourself walk in an orderly manner, keeping the Torah. As for the Gentiles who have believed, however, here's a little parenthetical that sort of doesn't fit, but they said it anyway. We have written by letter what we decided back in Acts 15 there, that they're to abstain from what's being offered to idols, from blood, from what is strangled, and from immorality. So they're basically going back to that Noahide rule that they had put onto the Gentiles at the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. So the next day, Paul took the men, purifying himself along with them, and he went into the temple, announcing when the days of the purification would be completed, and the sacrifice would be offered for each one of them. So there were a lot of rituals that went along with this purification, and they would have to go into the temple wearing white clothing, and take go into the mikvah and so forth. So this whole thing would have taken about 7 days, and so therefore, in 7 days, it could not have been a Nazarite vow, okay? Because Nazarite had a minimum of 30 days. So this was something less than a Nazarite vow, but it was still a vow, and it was certainly acceptable to regular Jewish people and Messianics, because Paul would not have been violating anything of his belief in Messiah and this new covenant by continuing on with the vows and the sacrifices. So their plan then was to prove to all the Jewish believers in Jerusalem, and all the Jews there, all the regular Jews there, that Paul had not abandoned the customs of the Jews. He was still the Jews' Jew. He had, of course, ceased to believe and teach that salvation came by obeying the Mosaic law. That is true. Paul didn't say, if you keep the law, then you don't really need Jesus, because that'll get you through. No, he doesn't say that at all. He says quite the opposite, that the law will not save you, but you have to come to salvation and in right standing with God through the sacrifice of Yeshua and believing in him as the Son of God. So there was Paul's major departure from mainstream Judaism, and so that's certainly that's what we believe today. And he was still a racial Jew, and I would say that he was still one of the commentators, and I've written it down here. I'm going to have to change it, but I would still say he is a Jew in religion also. It was just a different interpretation of what they thought was Judaism, but really what Paul was practicing was a more pure and a truer Judaism, because it was based on the intent and the spirit of the law, rather than just perhaps what was written down and what men had written down for for their halakha. So anyway, make it fast. Paul went with these guys. He paid their way. He went through the ceremonies, the cleansing, and so forth. And the comments made that Paul was a complete Jew now, and so they went through all of that, and this was not unprecedented. King Agrippa the First had come back from Rome. He did the same thing, because if you go into the, pagan countries, which is anything outside of Israel, when you return, you're supposed to go through a cleansing. So it's just you ladies talk about your detox and so on and so forth. Well, Paul and the Jews were doing detox 2,000 years ago. So Paul did what they suggested, because it did not conflict with anything that he would have believed as being a believer in Yeshua, and so he could do this with a good, clear conscience. And so then the James and the elders there, they repeated their conviction about the instructions of the Gentiles, that they had to keep the Noahide laws. Okay, so the Jew would going on with this vow. They would announce the completion of the vow, and then 7 days later they would present the offerings. And if Paul paid for all of those offerings, that was actually an act of piety, and it was a mitzvah. So that even, they could say, yeah, Paul's paying for his own stuff, big deal. But then when he paid for the sacrifices of the other four guys, which would have been a considerable amount of money, they say, okay, well, that's good. That's kind of a mitzvah. We'll give him that. So, all right, going ahead with 27 to 30 here. When the 7 days were about to be completed, the Jewish leaders from Asia saw Paul in the temple and began stirring up the whole crowd. They grabbed him, shouting, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching all men everywhere against our people and the Torah and this place. Besides, he had even brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place, for they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they assumed Paul had brought him into the temple." So the whole city was stirred up, and the people rushed together. They grabbed Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and the gates were shut at once. Okay, now this whole deal would have been right around Shavuot, probably just a little bit after Shavuot, and perhaps before. It's right at Shavuot, because Paul was trying to get back to Jerusalem for the feast of Shavuot. All right, and so these Jews, the Jews from Asia, these were non-believing Jews, possibly even from Ephesus, who knows? And they were not believers, and they charged Paul with the same kind of crimes and that the unbelieving Jews had accused Stephen of back 27 years ago, and basically that he was defiling the temple. Now you got to realize that for some people, the temple and its temple worship and its temple service actually outweighed, and it was more important than Torah itself. They kind of had this fetish about the temple and the temple service. That was the Saducees, the Sadducees, and they were really big into that. And so I would imagine that most of the trouble that Paul is getting into here are from the Saducees, the Sadducees, the other political party from the Prushim, the Pharisees. So he's accused of apostasy and defiling the temple by bringing this guy Trophimus into the temple. Now, I wanted to show you a picture. If you can see this picture here, hopefully you can see that it's kind of a plan view of the temple and the temple grounds and so forth. And a lot of this stuff, okay, that's the conventional wisdom. I'm not real sure about it because, as many of you know, I am one of those that kind of lean toward the idea that the temple might have actually been in the city of David, in the north end of the city of David, right next to what we call the Temple Mount. But anyway, if you'll see, this is kind of a plan of it. You got these outer courts, and these outer courts, any of this stuff in here, any Gentile could come in here. That's not a problem. You could come into these areas here. But now there would have been low screens or kind of a barrier. I look at it maybe something, if you think a Jersey barrier, you know what those barriers are that you got that separates you from in the highway, those big concrete deals that I can tell you from experience that if it's wet and you have a blowout and you hit the Jersey barrier, you can flip a Suburban right up on top of on its roof very easily, quite easily done. And you can travel down the highway a good little bit, spinning around all the time. It can be done. So these things will stop somebody and it was meant to keep the Gentiles from going into these inner courts. And so there are even two placards that have been recovered that says, okay, any Gentile that goes beyond these placards here, beyond these barriers, you are taking your life in your own hands, and the penalty is death. The Romans even allowed the Jews, in this case, to, if a Gentile went into those inner courts, that they could actually carry out a death sentence, a death penalty on these people without the Romans having to come in and rubber stamp it. So that kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about here. Now, these inner courts that and here you couldn't bring a Gentile into there, and you couldn't certainly, each one of them, each place that you went got more and more holy, as it were, and until you get down to here, which is the Holy of Holies. But so when they got Paul, he would have probably been in this inner court, or maybe in the court of the women. Because when they dragged him out, and then they said they closed the gate behind him. Okay, so they didn't want. They knew what they were going to do. They were going to beat the stuffing out of him until he was dead, and so they wanted him out of there and the gate closed so that they wouldn't defile the temple by beating somebody to death. So anyway. I got another picture here that gives you a 3D idea of what that may have looked like. And here's those Jersey barriers that I was talking about here that stood up, and they had the placards there that says, okay, you Gentiles, you cross this, you die, and it's on your own head. We warned you, something like that. And they've actually found two of these. I've seen. I saw one of them in the museum there in Jerusalem. It says, no man of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure around the temple, and whoever's caught will have himself to blame, that his death ensues. In other words, you cross this, you're going to die, and it's your own fault. So we don't know about Trophimus. Okay. Where is the Dome of the Rock relative to the graphic? All right, as best I know, all right, let's go back up to here. This graphic here is pretty much about the same places where the Dome of the Rock is. There at you got the dome right smack up there in the middle, and then a little bit over to the side of it, and I'm trying to think of which direction. It would have been a little bit northeast of where the Dome of the Rock is. There's a little portico, a little thing that it's, I don't know, 10, 12 feet in diameter, and it's got a little roof on it, and they say that was where the Holy of Holies was. And I saw people, walking through there, sitting down, and so on and so forth. And I didn't know if it was where the Holy of Holies was, but if they say it was, and if that's where it was, then okay, just to be on the safe side, I was not going to walk through there and sit down where the Holy of Holies was. And, it just didn't feel comfortable to me to do that. So I didn't. All right. So it's not too far. That the Dome of the Rock is not exactly where I think the dome would have been, just looking at this. Garden of Gethsemane is over toward the east. So this is the east. And you got the dome. So then the dome would have been the Dome of the Rock is somewhere like right down here someplace, as best I can remember from that. It's been a while, and you do get kind of turned around up there sometimes, especially when some goofuses over there hollering at you because you happen to be walking and holding your wife's hand at the same time up on the Dome of the Rock. Okay, so yeah, my guide told me, he says, it would not be a good idea to confront the guy because you were holding your wife's hand. Okay, we'll not do that. Another story. All right. So they drag Paul off, beating the stuffing out of him. The Romans hear about it, and let's go ahead with this. They were trying to kill him. The news came to the commander of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in chaos. Okay, that's kind of a hyperbole, that all Jerusalem. It was confined to up there on the temple. Immediately he took soldiers and centurions and rushed down to them. And upon seeing the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came up, arrested Paul, ordering him to be bound with 2 chains, meaning put a soldier on either side of him. That's maximum security. And then they began investigating what he had done. So Paul was actually saved by the Romans. You know, how ironic is that? And so they that's pretty self-explanatory what happened there. He couldn't get an idea, he couldn't get an answer, and so he said, all right, well, let's just take this guy away from him so that they don't beat him up and kill him, and then we'll try to sort this out. Going ahead on 34 to 36, it says, some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. As he could not determine the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into headquarters. When he came to the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the multitude of people that followed kept shouting, away with him, away with him. Okay, 27 years before that, they had also said, away with him, crucify him, to the Son of God, to Yeshua. So Paul was in pretty good company. All right, the mob took him away. Okay, this is, you watch TV today and you watch these Antifa riots and so forth. Just think that when you're seeing this, it's probably just about the same kind of stuff. They probably took him up to the Antonia fortress where he could be safe. And then Paul asked him, he says, wait, I talked to him a minute, and he said, "You speak Greek," and there was confusion, and so they and that's in this next verses here. So you speaking Greek, and because Paul says, "Hey, can I talk to you a minute?" And because what he thought he was an Egyptian who he had stirred up a bunch of trouble before, and so he had his troops out there, and they had come up against the Romans. It did not end well for the Jewish rebels or the Egyptians or whatever kind of rebellion it was, and the Romans quickly dispatched the rebels, even though there were still a number of the Sicarii, the daggermen, the assassins still remained. But the main body of that rebellion was quickly done away with. But Paul told him, said, look, no, I am a Jewish man from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no insignificant city. I beg you, let me speak to the people. When the commander had given him permission, Paul stood on the steps, motioned to the people with his hand. When there was a great hush, he spoke to them in Aramaic, saying, okay, you're going to have to wait until next week to find out what he says. But Paul gets up there and, even beat up. By this time, he's probably bloody. He's, may even have a fat lip. Who knows? I mean, he had been beaten up. And so then they're telling, he's telling this Roman commander, he says, can I speak to you? And there was something in Paul he was an educated man. He spoke Greek in a very educated fashion. And plus, he didn't pull his trump card yet here. He didn't say that, oh, and by the way, I am a Roman citizen, because then the Roman guy would have probably had a heart attack. But anyway, he looked at him and he says, okay, I haven't figured this stuff out, but okay, you're safe now. You can sit up here on this balcony, and you can speak down to these people and talk to them, and we'll see if we can sort some of this stuff out. And therein, that ends chapter 21.